Hello, good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to today's Beyond the Studio series. This is our third in a 7-part series we're calling Beyond the Studio, Architecture in Practice. Today's topic is on building codes, and you are in treat because our very own Eirene Knott will be presenting, and she brings a world of expertise to this topic. My name is Wendy Mueller. I work here in the training department at BRR and will be moderating today's presentation. For years, the BRR team has worked with colleges and universities to support the next crop of talent coming into our field. And while we normally can do that in the office, the pandemic has canceled some of those plans. And so we are excited to be able to connect with all of you today to offer our insights into the working inside the architectural field. So for those of you who have not been on the prior two, we're offering these every Tuesday at 2:30 p.m. Today, as I said, we'll be listening to a wonderful presentation by Eirene Knott. Eirene is the Director of Code Services for BRR. She's been with the firm for 9 years, and she has more than 25 certifications in various building code specialty practices. A little plug for BRR. Not all firms have their own code professional, so we are very proud to have her here on our staff, where she is able to collaborate hand in hand with our architects and designers to help ensure that our projects are meeting the jurisdictional requirements and everything goes off smoothly. So Eirene, we are just so excited to have you today. Before I turn it over to Eirene, just a few administrative details for listeners today. If you have any questions for Eirene, and we really encourage you to ask them, go ahead and submit them using the chat feature on the YouTube dashboard to the right-hand side of your screen. I'll be monitoring those questions, and we will be addressing those at the end of the presentation today. We are recording today's webinar, so if there's anybody you know who was not able to attend today, they are welcome to come back to the BRR channel on YouTube to review a recording of it. Also, just a reminder that next week will be the 4th in our 7-part series. That topic will be on Revit, CAD, and scanning in the professional world. So we'd like to encourage you to sign up for that one as well, and I will give you information on that at the end of today's presentation. So without any further ado, I'd like to get us started. Eirene, take it away.
Thank you, Wendy. I'd like to welcome everybody today. And let's get into our program. My name is Eirene Knott. I am, as you can see by my initials on the screen, I am a Master Code Professional, a Certified Fire Marshal, and a Certified Building Official. I've been with BRR for 9 years, and I've worked for more than 25 years overall in my career with the code enforcement and the development profession. I started out working as a building inspector, moved my way up to a building official, worked in the public sector for nearly 20 years, and now I've been working with BRR in the private sector, helping architects in their designs. So my primary duties at BRR work with the designers on their original designs, making sure that those designs comply with code requirements, and we do work all over the country. So I have to know the codes from New York to California, Hawaii to Alaska. So it's a challenge to be up to date on all of that stuff, but I enjoy doing it, and it keeps me on my toes. I'm also a member of our quality control group, which reviews everything before it goes out to building permit. So if I have any issues that need to be addressed at that point, we can take care of those before they go out for permit. And then almost 9 times out of 10, we get building code comments back in our review, so I help respond to those code comments. And then one other thing that I provide in-house training for our architectural staff on code-related topics and get them so they can be AIA certified so they can use those for their continuing education credits. I've been a member of the International Code Council for many, many years and have been active in the development of codes for approximately 18 years. So today we're going to talk about what is a code, why we have codes, go through a history of the codes, talk about various types of codes, how codes are developed, and then I'll spend a little bit of time at the very end just basically giving you a synopsis of the International Building Code, which is the one that you'll use most as a designer. As Wendy said, don't forget to register for our next seminar and make sure you submit your questions in the chat function, and Wendy will monitor those and we'll ask those at the end of the presentation. I'm sure some of you have seen something like this. I'm not real sure it meets code. I think there's a few too many conductors in that box. And as you can see in the picture, there's an exit sign above the doors and everything's blocking the exit. So this would be a code violation. And I don't know if this is what's happening on the outside of that door, but there's a good probability that that might be happening there as well. So even if the door wasn't blocked on the inside, now you can't get out on the outside. And then here's an example on the picture on the right-hand side of the screen. This is someone making fireworks. Picture on the left is a hospital. Building code addresses issues where you don't have something that has an easy detonation hazard, so there's a fireworks facility next door or adjacent to a hospital which has people in it that cannot take care of themselves. So what is a code? It's a body of laws and it's constantly evolving. It's a living document. Since it's a body of laws, it has to be adopted. So a local jurisdiction or a state can adopt the code in order for it to be enforced. It contains the word shall, which means these are things that you have to comply with. And it is revised every 3 years. As I said, it's constantly evolving. It is a living document. And they try to keep up with construction technologies as well as new materials that may be available. And then it gets updated as incidents occur throughout the code construction development, such as 9/11. And I'll talk about a few others here in a minute. And the first one, why do I have to meet code? This is a fire that took place in the Beverly Hills Supper Club in Southgate, Kentucky. It took place on May 28, 1977. It was the deadliest fire in U.S. history since 1944 and the third deadliest nightclub fire in U.S. history. Over 200 people were injured, 175 people were killed, and most of the people that were killed were in rooms that were not intended to handle the occupant load that was in there. So the rooms in which most lives were lost were double the occupant load it could safely accommodate. There were no sprinklers in this building, so the next code cycle that came out after this fire took place was to require sprinklers in an assembly occupancy that had more than 300 people. It also increased the requirements for fire alarm systems, and in this case, the building was added on to multiple times, and there was never sufficient egress for the intended occupant load. Another example of why we have codes happened in Las Vegas at the MGM Hotel. This is on November 21st of 1980. It was the worst disaster in Nevada history, third worst hotel fire in modern US history. 650 people were injured, 85 were killed, and as a result of this, sprinkler requirements changed for hotels. So what happened in this case, the local inspector allowed an exception in the code for sprinkler requirements in an area that was open 24 hours. In this particular case, the deli area and where this fire broke out was actually closed. When the hotel was open, they originally told the jurisdiction that they would have this restaurant area open for 24 hours. Well, as time progressed, that area became closed, and so the fire started and nobody noticed it. Fire got out of control and spread throughout the hotel. So as a result of this, sprinkler and fire alarm systems were required throughout the building after being sold after the fire damage was repaired. So 3 months later, another fire on the strip happened, and between the two fires, the county changed their development codes and required that all hotels taller than 55 feet in height had to be retrofitted with sprinklers. Any future hotels 3 or more stories in height had to have sprinklers in it. Bottom line of this fire was the result in a major failure in plan review and inspections, not a failure in fire suppression. Another example, as I indicated, was 9/11. So there were 2,996 people killed. More than 90% of those were above the point of impact, so they couldn't even get out of the building. So as a result, the spray applied fire resistance requirements in the building code changed, and they also created a development of what's called a fire service access elevator and an occupant evacuation elevator. So the fire service access elevator allows fire service to get into the building and move quickly throughout and help occupants evacuate utilizing the occupant evacuation elevators. Another example is the Station nightclub. This happened February 20th, 2003 in Warwick, Rhode Island. It's the fourth deadliest nightclub in U.S. history. We talked about the third one being the Beverly Hills Supper Club. There were 462 people in the building that had an occupant load of 410. Of those 462, 230 were injured and 100 were killed. So on the screen in front of you is a floor plan of the Station nightclub. And the area in the back here in this blue, that blue contains spray foam. And what happened is the band used pyrotechnics. So the blue spray foam plastic insulation caught fire when the pyrotechnics went off and spread the fire throughout the building. So you have an exit next to the stage, you have an exit here, you have another exit off on this corner, and then one in the back. So what happened is everybody in the nightclub wasn't aware of the other exits. The only one they knew was this one that they came into. So everybody piled up in front of this exit, and now you have this guardrail outside that blocked them from getting out very efficiently. So the bodies piled up at the front door. So the screen in front of you now represents a study that was done by the National Institute of Standards and Technology, which is regulated under the Department of Commerce. They work with industry to develop and apply technologies to take measurements and standards, and they also investigate fires. So this is the floor plan of the restaurant, the nightclub. And what you see in front of you is the temperature. So on the right-hand side of the screen is a scale. At the very top of the scale is 1,000 degrees centigrade. So that's a pretty hot fire. So as you can see in the picture, more than almost 50% or close to 50% of that building had a temperature of over 1,000 degrees within 90 seconds of that fire starting. This illustrates the amount of oxygen. So as you can see at the very bottom of the screen, the red indicates 0% oxygen. So this was taken at 5 feet above the floor after 90 seconds. So 50% of that building, or pretty close to that, had no oxygen at 5 feet above the floor after 90 seconds of that fire starting. This last image represents what the conditions would be if the building had had a sprinkler system in it. And as you can see in this very tiny area right here, that's where the fire started. And that's where the most heat would have been. And with a sprinkler system installed, that would have been the fire would have been self-contained. So why is this important? The reason this took place is plan review didn't happen in this case, because under the building code at the time, even though it went from a restaurant to a nightclub, there was no plan review required. So this new facility moved into this existing building and made some changes that didn't necessarily require a building permit. So as a result, things happen, and now the codes have changed. So now you can't have foam plastic requirements in a situation like this, or if you do provide them, there are limited applications as to where they can be applied. They also changed the sprinkler requirements. We talked about the Beverly Hills Supper Club changing the occupant load to 300 requiring sprinklers. Now we've changed the occupant load for a nightclub down to 100 people or more. Not only do we have to meet the code to provide for people who occupy the building to get out in an emergency, we also have to provide requirements for those who come into the building to help get people out. In this case, this is a hotel fire in Houston, Texas, took place on May 31st, 2013. More than 150 firefighters fought the blaze. Took them more than 2 hours to get the fire under control. As a result, 4 firefighters died and 13 were injured. And to this day, they still do not have a determination of the cause of the fire. So here's an example of where not only are we designing buildings to make it safe for people who are in them, but we're trying to make it safe for people who have to show up and help people get out in an emergency. So let's talk a little bit about the history of building codes. The very first code was the Code of Hammurabi, and this is a picture of it in the Louvre Museum in Paris. This was established in around 3000 BC, and essentially the way the code works, let's say a builder built a home for you. Well, if your child dies while you're living in that home, then the child of the builder gets to be slain. So it's kind of very primitive culture when it comes to how we enforce a code, but it basically put a value that codes are important, that you need to build a house that's going to withstand your lifeline. Then we have the Great Fire of London, which took place in 1666. The Great Chicago Fire, which took place in 1871, the San Francisco earthquake, which took place in 1906, and the most recent natural event that had a huge impact on building codes was Hurricane Andrew in 1992. This completely changed how the building code was developed in Florida and required a lot more hurricane provisions, which to this day have been very effective based on the last few hurricanes that have gone through the state of Florida. Here in the United States, the very first building code that was published came out in 1905, and it was basically a push that came from the insurance industry. The insurance industry wanted some kind of code or some language to help making people be responsible for what was being built across the country and to help diminish the claims that were being provided for to the insurance company. So when BOCA was created, it essentially covered the northeastern United States. Then in 1927, the ICBO organization came out with a uniform building code. This essentially covered anything west of the Mississippi. And last but not least, we have what was called the Standard Building Code. Some people called this the Southern Building Code, and it basically covered the Southeast. So between the entire country, we had 3 building codes. Well, at some point, someone decided that maybe we only needed 1 building code across the country. So in 2000, those 3 organizations, BOCA, ICBO, and SBCCI, came together and created the International Code Council and developed the International Building Code, which has been the code that's been predominant throughout the United States since then. So I've talked about codes, but now we have a variety of codes that we actually utilize today in our designs. So first of all, we have the building code, which we have the International Building Code. And then we also have a building code that's published by the National Fire Protection Association, or NFPA. We also have fire codes. And again, NFPA has what they call a life safety code. So this applies mostly to existing buildings, but there are some provisions for new buildings in there. Then we get into systems. So we have mechanical codes, we have electrical codes, we have plumbing codes, fuel gas codes. Then we get into energy and accessibility. So what you see on the screen is the ICC A117. This is the accessibility standard that is referenced by the building code. So it works in conjunction with the building code on how to make your buildings accessible. So the building code tells you what needs to be accessible. The A117 tells you how to make it accessible. We also have to comply with federal regulations. So we have to comply with the 2010 ADA standards. And then last but not least, we have sustainability. So as more jurisdictions start adopting sustainability codes across the country, we'll be working together with them on this. The picture you see in front of you is the International Green Construction Code, which is published by the International Code Council. This particular version and all versions moving forward was developed in conjunction with ICC, ASHRAE, LEED, USGBC, and AIA. They all worked together to develop one code, so we had one level of sustainability across the country. So how does a code get developed? Anyone can write a code change. What happens is ICC generally has a deadline for codes to be submitted in January. So I told you earlier they're developed on a 3-year cycle. So January of 2022 is the deadline for the next code cycle process, which will cover a portion of the codes that ICC publishes. And next cycle would include the building code. So in January of 2022, if you have a code change that you want to submit, you have to get on ICC's website, submit your code change. It gets uploaded to a database where that information is then handled by staff. And those codes then get developed into an order of how they're going to be heard, and they're heard in the order in which they're published in the building code. So you start with everything in chapter 1 and work your way through chapter 35. So those are heard by a committee, and that committee is usually made up of 10 to 15 people that represent the industry, and they decide whether they're going to approve your code change, modify your code change, or disapprove your code change. So based on the result of that committee hearing, then there's another hearing that takes place in the fall. So it's usually September, October, and that's the public comment hearing. At that hearing, you go up to the microphone and testify as to why you want to overturn what the committee did. Say the committee disapproved your code change. So at the public hearing, you go up to the microphone and convince everybody there who's a voting member why you want your code changed approved. The difference between the committee hearing and the public comment hearing, the committee are the only people that votes at that hearing. So you have to convince those people that are up on a panel why your code change needs to be approved. When you're at the public comment hearing, everybody who's a voting member of ICC can vote. In this case, you have to be somebody who enforces the code. So when I worked in the public sector, I was a voting member of ICC. Since I now work in the private sector and I don't enforce the code, I basically interpret the code. I am not a voting member of ICC, so I cannot vote at the public comment hearings. But I can go to the comment hearings and try to convince the people there that vote that my code change should be approved. Then after that, those people that weren't able to attend the public comment hearing does an online voting and goes through a final voting process. So I'll give you a great example. We're getting ready to start publishing the 2021 IBC. So I told you the code changes are due in January of 2022. Those code changes in January 2022 will be published as the 2024 IBC. In the 2018, I made 5 code changes to the 2018 IBC that would be in the 2021 IBC, and all 5 of them were successfully approved. However, they were all disapproved by the committees. So I had to argue my stance in front of the committees, and then I had to go to the public comment hearing. In the public comment hearing, I was able to convince everybody that my 5 code changes should be approved. I tried the same thing for the International Existing Building Code for the what is now the 2021. I had probably 5 or 6 code changes for that one. Not a single one of them got approved. So even somebody like me who has a lot of experience in code development can still get their code changes not approved. However, I've learned how to write code changes. So if you submit a huge one that the committee has to stop and think about and spend too much time on, they're more than likely not going to approve it. But if you break it into smaller chunks, they might approve it for you. I also served on the committee that heard some of those code changes, so that helps a little bit too. I couldn't vote, but I served on the committee that was able to hear some of those code changes. So I want to wrap up today talking a little bit about the International Building Code, because this is what I'm most intimately familiar with. And it's broken into 35 chapters, and what you can see on the screen is kind of broken it up into sections so that it's easier to find how the code gets applied in different applications. So at the very end of the code book has the appendices. And one thing I want to note, every international code, so be it the building code, plumbing code, mechanical code, chapter 2 always contains definitions. How do you know what's in chapter 2? Any word that's italicized within the body of that code book will be defined in chapter 2. So just keep that in mind as you go through your career. I want to talk a little bit about occupancy classifications, because this is something that you'll spend a lot of time on. So we have assembly, which is going to be places of large gatherings of people. And we have A1s, which are theaters. And A2 is a restaurant or a nightclub, anything that has food or drink. And A3 can be a church, a library, a gymnasium. And A4 gets into indoor sporting arenas. And an A5 is an outdoor sporting arena. B for business, pretty self-explanatory. Then we get into E for education. This is education through the 12th grade only. So if you're talking about a college campus, that would not be an E, that would most likely fall under B for business or A for assembly, depending on how big the classrooms are. E's can also include small daycare facilities. Then we get into factory or industrial applications, so places where things are made. So we have F1, which is a moderate hazard, so we're building things that may be flammable, such as alcoholic beverages that have over 16% alcohol, a woodworking facility, a dry cleaning facility. Then we have F2, which gets into low hazards. So these are things that are made that are not very combustible. So we're talking about sheetrock, alcoholic beverages, as long as they're under 16% alcohol. Brick and masonry manufacturers, those would be an F1. Then we get into H's. So an H1 could be dynamite, and here we have Napoleon dynamite. So an H1 is anything that has a detonation hazard, so it's going to blow up. An H2, such as flammable liquid, so gasoline would be an H2, it's considered a flammable liquid. So what happens with flammable liquids, once they catch fire, they spread and they accelerate the burning. Then we have an H3, which is a combustible liquid, different than a flammable liquid. A combustible liquid will support combustion, where the flammable liquid will actually help accelerate the burning. Then we get into H4, which is a health hazard. So ammonia, for example, is a health hazard. And then we get into H5, which are semiconductor fabrication facilities. Then we get into our institutional occupancies. We have an I1, which is an assisted living facility for more than 16 people. So this is people that need continual care. Then we get into an I2, and this would be a hospital or a nursing home. So these people are not capable of self-preservation in an emergency. We get into I3, so this would be somebody in a restraint or security provision, such as a jail. And then I4s are daycares, and daycares can be for any age. It could be for adult or children. M for mercantile, and we have R for residential. So we have R1, which is transient, which would be hotels where people stay for less than 30 days. Then we get into R2s, which are primarily permanent in nature. So these would be apartments, dormitories. This could even be an extended stay hotel. So they're non-transient people. They're staying there for a longer time. They're going to be more familiar with their surroundings. Then we get into R3. So this could be a permanent care facility for less than 5 people, such as drug rehabilitation. And then we have R4, which is assisted living, which would be between 5 and 16 people. If you're more than 16 people, you'd fall under the institutional occupancy. Then we get into S, which is for storage. So we talked earlier about factory and industrial. So this would be perhaps the storage of those items that are made in the Fs. So again, we have S1, which is going to be a moderate hazard. So anything that's stored here is going to be somewhat flammable, such as clothing or tires. And then we have an S2 occupancy, so these are going to be lower hazards such as sheetrock. And last but not least, we have our U category. And in the picture on the screen, in the middle of this picture is a tree. That tree is a cell phone tower. So cell phone towers can be classified as U for utility. This could also include fences, perhaps some agricultural buildings such as barns. And then the last thing I want to talk about in the building code has to do with construction types. So as you see on the screen, there's 5 different types, and then there's A's and B's noted with them. So I want to discuss what the differences is with those. So basically that table says we have non-combustible buildings and we have combustible buildings. So what's the difference between the two? Non-combustible means it will not support combustion. So if a fire starts, that particular material is not going to attribute to that fire and help the fire grow. We know that steel can melt in a fire, but steel does not support combustion. So steel would be a non-combustible material. And then we get into combustible construction. So these items are going to burn and they're going to attribute to the fire and add fuel to it. So the building code wants some of the structural elements associated with the building to either be protected, which means we're going to put spray applied fireproofing on them, or we're going to encapsulate those structural members in gypsum. So on that table, anything noted as A means it's protected, which means it has at least a 1-hour rating. Then we also have unprotected, so our structural elements don't have to have any fire protection associated with them, with one exception. So if we go back to this table, those elements on the right, type 1 and type 2, I'm sorry, that's on the left, those are non-combustible construction. And the ones on the right, type 3, 4, and 5, those are combustible construction. So type 3, 4, and 5 allow wood to be within the premise of the building in terms of structural elements. So I said A was protected, so everything has to have at least a 1-hour rating. And then B does not have to have any protection, with the exception of type 1B. So when we're building with type 1 construction, we're going to rate everything with at least a 2-hour rating. And when we're type 1A, it's going to have a 3-hour rating. So these buildings are essentially allowed to be as tall and as big as possible as you want them as a designer, with the understanding that you've made it non-combustible and everything has at least a 2 or a 3-hour rating associated with it. And with that, we thank you for being here with us today, and I'll turn it back over to Wendy.
Great. Thank you so much, Eirene. We do have several questions. This is a fascinating topic. First question is, if a city has different building code requirements than the IBC. Which one do you follow?
You have to follow whatever the jurisdiction has adopted. However, most jurisdictions have language in their code somewhere to say if one's more restricted than the other, the more restrictive is going to apply. So if you're designing under the building code and the code that the jurisdiction has adopted is not as restringent or as restrictive as the IBC, then I would design under the IBC. But that's something you may have to sit down with a local building official and discuss and find out what's going to work best with your design.
Great, thank you. Another question is, if there is a consistent basis of code variances on a specific code for multiple projects, will the code be updated with an exception to further allow that variance?
If a jurisdiction has established a precedent that those have been accepted, then it may not need to have a code modification, but it might be to your advantage to get the code changed so that it would be more clearly defined as to what's permitted and what's not. Does that answer the question?
I think so.
Okay.
And then another one, is it possible to have buildings be two types of occupancy?
Yes, you can have what's called a mixed occupancy. A great example of that is our own office building. We have a parking garage, which the building code calls an S2 occupancy. We have B for business, and we also have an assembly space. So we have an A3 within our building. And in order to make our building code compliant, we had to separate everything. So we had to put at least 1 hour ratings between all those occupancies, but our building is a perfect example of a mixed occupancy.
Great. Right. Audience, if there are any other questions, I do encourage you to type them in the chat feature. While we're waiting, I will remind everyone that next week's session will be on Revit, CAD, and scanning in the professional world with our very own Steve Burton. And you can register for that one just like you did today's on our Eventbrite site. Let me just double check there aren't any more questions. Doesn't look like it. All right, everybody, thank you so much for your time and for joining us today for our Building Codes webinar, the third in our 7-part series. Be sure to check the BRR blog at www.brrarch.com to view the schedule of the remainder of our upcoming topics. I will also just put a plug in for that blog. It's a great thing to be checking regularly. We're always updating it with new and interesting and timely topics to the important to the architecture and design world. Also, just a reminder, feel free to share the information with others who may be interested. You can invite